It sure is nice to be back with you. I've taken a break while I moved to a new institution, but my latest Mortarboard podcast about how higher education may be spending $50 billion a year on nothing got such a heavy response that I couldn't resist posting a video. Stay tuned. My Mortarboard podcast released this week was an interview with Brad Kelsheimer, the CFO of Lumina Foundation, perhaps the largest private foundation dedicated to higher education in the United States. The foundation produced a well-researched and startling study about the impact of excess capacity in higher education. The study compares the physical capacity and cost of that physical capacity in higher education to the number of students available to fill that capacity, going all the way back to the 1950s. For much of that time, capacity roughly met demand, but as enrollment began to fall beginning around 2010 and capacity remained the same or increased, the per-student cost began to increase. And just as interesting, the amount of unused capacity began to increase. Why is this so interesting? It's because roughly 70% of all of the expenses of a brick-and-mortar institution are fixed. This means that the cost of an empty classroom or an empty seat in that classroom doesn't really decrease just because enrollment has decreased. In essence, colleges are sized and priced for full capacity, regardless of whether or not they're at full capacity, and typically cost as much to operate, whether they are at full capacity and thus bringing in the fullest possible revenue, or classrooms are empty. In other words, excess capacity is waste, real waste. The Lumina Foundation study estimated that American higher education may be wasting as much as $50 billion a year, that's billion with a B, on its operations because of facilities costs and personnel costs that can't be adjusted when enrollment declines. Buildings must still be maintained, heated, staffed. The faculty tenure system means that decreasing full-time instructional personnel is a lengthy, complex, and highly regulated process, and in most cases can't be implemented as rapidly as changes occur. This study isn't an indictment of higher education, and I'm certainly not offering an indictment either. It's not even a claim that this waste is deliberate. Rather, it's an identification and qualification of a waste that is often unseen and certainly difficult to quantify in the aggregate. It's a waste that is a byproduct of the type of system that we have. And so if we'd rather either save that $50 billion and spend it on something more valuable, or just not tax it at all, we need to understand what is causing the waste, and we need to think carefully about the system that's producing it. The study offers some solutions to this problem, but none of them are painless. One option is for schools to grow enrollment to decrease underutilization, but thus far schools have not been particularly successful at this approach because the traditional market is shrinking. A second option is for schools to share more costs by sharing more services. There are almost 6,000 higher education institutions in the United States, and so there is some inefficiency created by that fragmentation. A third option is to take capacity offline, to merge with other institutions or close programs, schools, or entire institutions, which reduces overall capacity. But this is typically a last resort, because substantial consolidation or closure has ripple effects in the communities that have come to depend on their higher education institutions as a local economic driver. And of course, there's often a lot of school or local pride at stake. So there's never a lot of enthusiasm for that third option. The podcast got a pretty healthy response, and I thought I would share with you some of the responses that I got. I'll say right up front that I suspect a number of these responses are from people who didn't actually listen to the podcast. They just saw the promotion for it, saw that it was about the higher education spending $50 billion a year on nothing, and had an opinion about what they thought the podcast might be about. In many cases, they were wrong, but we can still learn something from their responses. Other people listened carefully to the podcast and had some very specific opinions. One person wrote, "One person's nothing is another person's pet project, and that pet project can probably provide a couple of solid extemporaneous paragraphs explaining why that particular nothing is needed. The people who call it nothing probably have an axe to grind rather than a similarly reasoned argument." Well, this is an example, I think, of someone who's not actually listened to the podcast. And so they think that nothing refers to a qualitative evaluation about a project or some sort of value judgment. The Lumina study is about the actual number of dollars actually spent on real things, space and people, in which nothing is received in return for that expenditure. That's not an axe to grind, it's an analytic result. A response I particularly enjoyed was this one. Saying empty classrooms during a pandemic provide nothing is like saying my snowblower provides nothing during July. It's true, but it doesn't mean the money spent on the snowblower is wasted. As someone who used to live in the snow belt of Western New York, I can tell you that I appreciated my snowblower in July a lot because I knew it was waiting for me when I would need it in December. It's an interesting analogy, but it's a false one. You're wasting money on the snowblower if there is no snow planned for your area for years to come. You have a snowblower because you expect snow. But higher education enrollment is projected to decline for years, perhaps decades to come. Not to mention, that snowblower is depreciating the whole time. One person responded, the amount of money that gets wasted on useless marketing and unnecessary administrative processes is absolutely stupendous. I could cut $1 million a year out of the budget just on the waste I see. There's a lot packed into this comment. I don't deny for a minute that administrative bloat is an issue, and I don't deny for a minute that colleges, like many large organizations, can waste money. But the point of the Lumina study is not the waste that is visible, it's the waste that is invisible. It's the first study that I've seen that attempts to quantify what it actually costs when a classroom is sitting empty for an hour a day or 3 hours a day or the whole day, and then calculate that across the entire institution, and then calculates that across all institutions within the United States. So it's not that this commenter is wrong, it's that he or she doesn't understand what the study is measuring. An interesting comment is this one. This is especially true for colleges, but it's an issue for almost every employer these days. COVID and the remote productivity tools that have become standard as a result revealed that most employers don't need nearly as much space as they've built or leasing. I have no doubt this is true, although I'm glad that the commenter recognizes the problem is especially true for colleges because their costs are so fixed. A company can stop leasing a building, but a college campus typically isn't leasing the campus. Many of its staff are required by federal regulations involving financial aid, human resources, Title IX, or others. And as I mentioned earlier, faculty tenure in many cases makes adjustments in the total workforce challenging. That's not a cheap shot against tenure. I was a tenured faculty member myself, and I think tenure exists for a good reason. But there's no question that it leaves organizations less nimble. That same commenter related an interesting specific point about his or her own institution. Even before COVID, the utilization rates on everything from classroom space to labs and staff offices was shockingly low. At my university, our classrooms were only 22% utilized during daytime hours, and even when they were utilized, most classrooms were only half full. That's a result of every school on campus insisting that they have their own dedicated space rather than sharing. Meanwhile, we've completely run out of office space for staff in my building. Yet at any given time, even before COVID, you could walk through the offices and cube farms and find that 80% of them are vacant as people were somewhere else on campus, working from home, on vacation or sick, etc. I don't know if this account mirrors your own institution, but it does bring back a sad memory for me. I was once in a president's cabinet meeting where the academic leaders were complaining that they did not have enough classroom space. The next morning, I walked around the main academic building of the campus at 9 a.m. and simply photographed every empty classroom. More than half of all the classrooms were empty at 9 a.m. on a Wednesday. I sent those photographs to the same administrators who had complained about the lack of space. At the risk of overgeneralizing, it does seem to me that higher education tends to measure space in terms of availability rather than actual utilization. If you haven't listened to this fascinating interview with Brad Kelsheimer, I urge you to do so. The Mortarboard podcast is available on iTunes and all other major podcast outlets. If you like what you heard on this show, now is the right time to hit that like and subscribe button below. I hope that your spring semester is going well and that you are safe and healthy. I look forward to talking with you again soon.